Welcome to what is going to be an amazing panel, Action for Diversity. And as well as being an outspoken woman, my name's LJ Locke, not Dr. Black. A number of people have asked me about Bletchley Park. That's not me, unfortunately. But as well as being an outspoken woman and running a panel tomorrow on amplifying your impact and influence in the workplace, I'm also the chair of the Time's Up equivalent here in Australia, which is Now Australia. And we're all about ending sexual harassment in the workplace, and a big part of that is having diversity in the workplace. So very, very keen to hear today's panel in action, and I'd like to hand over to Lisa. There will be questions at the end, so 15 minutes of questions. So if you could let the panel go through their process, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. So over to you, Lisa.
Brilliant. Thank you, LJ. And is my mic on? Can everyone hear me okay at the back there? No. I think we need a little bit up. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Okay, well, welcome. Thanks for that intro. This is a panel on the Engineering Task Force for Australia. So it's an informal group that is kind of gradually, well, quite quickly being created by a group of engineering deans and other stragglers like myself who really want to get a step change in engineering education and preparing young people for engineering and the future jobs. And getting gender equity in engineering is a huge problem. So I'm Lisa Harvey-Smith. I'm a professor of practice at University of New South Wales in Sydney. I'm the Australian Government's Women in STEM Ambassador. And I'd like to first introduce the panel members who are going to be chatting with me today. First on the end there is Dr. Margaret Hartley, CEO of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. Next to her is Professor Madhu Bhaskaran, Associate Dean at the School of Engineering at RMIT University. We've got Mark Hoffman, Professor Mark Hoffman, who is Dean of Engineering at UNSW Sydney. And next to me, Professor Elanor Huntington, Dean of Engineering at ANU. So we were some of those protagonists. So please make the panel welcome, first of all. So we have Elizabeth Croft as well, who is the Dean of Engineering at Monash University, Professor Elizabeth Croft. And she and her colleagues actually started this group that met earlier on this year to discuss some of the problems and challenges facing engineering education in this country. And we were determined to do something to shake it up. So we wanted to cause a bit of trouble, which is always good. And in particular to fix the long-standing problem, the identity crisis that engineering has in this country, and the problems it has with gender and other types of diversity as well. The stats are pretty grim. In higher education, only about 17% of university engineering enrolments are female. In vocational engineering, in vocational education and training, that is a lot lower, 9%. So 9% in engineering-related vet courses are female. So what that means in real terms is the whole world is being designed by men. Is that good enough?
No.
It's not good enough, and it's not sufficient for our modern world, and it's not sufficient for... It shows a system that is not fit for purpose, essentially. So the Engineering Task Force was created to commit to action very quickly. We didn't want to talk, we know what the problems are, and we want to create solutions and work together to move forward with those solutions. So one of the things we did, we hired a researcher to produce a piece of work outlining 3 key actions or major interventions that would help to make a positive change, in particular focusing on the engineering pathway for young women going through education and going into either vet training relevant to engineering or higher education and training. So we are still doing this piece of work. We're waiting for a final report. But what we wanted to do is discuss some of our findings, our ideas, and then open it up to the floor. So we have 5 members of that task force here today. We have Elizabeth as well in the audience. And I would like to start off with a question to Margaret. So Margaret, we've talked about the problem of the engineering identity in this country. What do we mean by that? And why is it an issue?
Well, thanks, Lisa. I think really the engineering identity is really in terms of the public recognition of what engineering might encompass, and also in schools what it might encompass as a career. So, and clearly with your statistics, you know, the real demand for diversity as we move up the pipeline has to start down at school areas. I wonder if really the population, particularly parents, would understand what an engineer is and does, and particularly what they'll do in the future. And also, have we translated enough of the understanding of the practice of engineering into the future workforce so that schools can actually, and school children, as they're learning and deciding on subjects later on in their senior years, can actually make some informed choices about what that might entail and what it might actually mean to them in the future. And I was in the session before this, a fascinating session, 2 sessions, on artificial intelligence, and it's absolutely true that the technology revolution has really not started yet. We're just seeing the beginnings of it, and we're going to have to really be equipped to face the way that our work and the way we live changes, and we have to have enough, I think, a diverse workforce in engineering, because that's going to be part of that solution to actually engaging of the jobs of the future. So I think the identity is probably poor in Australia. It's less so in other countries, and I think exploring why that is. I do know that in the UK they've spent a lot of time and effort promoting the value of engineering, the value of mathematics and the value of engineering to the population, so that they can get, so children can get advice about what career structures look like.
So we talked about this, all of us together, about how engineering isn't explicitly named in school curricula, but kids do engineering. They do design and tech. They do all sorts of engineering in school, but it's called science or design and tech or something else. So is that part of the identity crisis? And what can we do? Because kids don't do law and they don't do medicine necessarily in school, but they actually then go on to be lawyers and doctors, and those are high sort of status professions.
Absolutely.
So what's the difference with engineering?
Well, I think it's the same with science too. There's almost what we're seeing is that girls might get told that doing maths is hard, and they might want to look at a different career. So there's these points of decision making and influencing by teachers and career professionals. And it's very hard to be what you can't see either. So if girls aren't seeing positive role models and examples of women who are changing the world through their engineering, and it's a variety of engineering. We talk about engineering as a one single thing, but it's, I'll let my colleagues, I'm not an engineer, here's my guilty secret, I'm a biological scientist. But I mean, really, I think it's about putting in front of students and parents positive role models of young men and women who are doing engineering. And certainly the work we've done on our schools programs shows that if you bring to a teacher the capacity to do inquiry-based learning, in other words, problem solving, in team-based things, in real-world capacities, then you get full engagement from girls and boys as well. And the 3 things you need in that process is you need a confident teacher who's well supported in actually teaching inquiry-based learning, and a lot of our teachers are struggling in that area. You need to have career profiles that actually keep reinforcing that, and you also need to have the school system in that it gives the flexibility and the real-world context. So we're now in about 715 schools. 1 million kids have done the course, and the main thing is it's embedded in the school. Every child in the school does it, and we find that we're having increased enrolments in senior science, girls and boys, because they can see that you can solve real-world problems. We use climate change and sustainability for them to teach all of the physical sciences through that. So, but if you don't have the role models as well, if we can't show what your life could look like, then when children make and people make this career decision at the age of, 14, 15, 16, which is an unusual thing because most people change careers 3 or 4 times in a year.
7 times in the future.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yes, I'm only a 3-person changer, but multiple jobs in that period. So I think that identity is because it's not seen. And I think parents don't see engineers, whereas you go to a doctor and you certainly see lawyers, and who are our role models in normal society? There's not many engineers on television, although there's certainly new programs, but I just think we need to do better to put forward technology, engineering, ICT in front of the public and show the benefit and the value in doing those courses.
So teasing that out a little bit more with maybe some of the other members of the panel. So who are the key audiences for those messages? And, you know, my office has funding for campaigns to try and make engineering more attractive and engineering career paths, you know, more visible to young people. Who are the key audiences for these types of campaigns, and you know, what sort of stage do we need to get people at?
We've worked very hard to increase numbers into the engineering program. I just sort of just numbers. There's 17,000 people studying engineering at UNSW, and in 2014, 19% of the entry was female, and we set a target by 2020 of making that 30%, and we hit 28% this year. I do hope we'll hit it. I'm worried we'll miss it by fractions of percent, but anyway.
And that's to enrol.
Yes, if anyone wants to enrol just to fix my stats, that'd
engineering
be great.
tolerances, it'll be fun.
Just a fee waiver, please.
Yeah. And that's 1,400 extra females, extra women studying engineering. And we made a conscious effort that it would be difficult to influence them at schools, because we were just one group and there were about 2,000 schools across the state. Multiply it by the country, it's too much, and we really would struggle to do that. So we started focusing on basically running things such as camps, and also went and spoke to industry. And we've actually found that industry is our greatest advocate for this. Just sort of by, February this year, the Bureau of Statistics released some employment figures of engineers. And graduate female engineers are now paid 6% more on average than male graduate engineers. And a really interesting one that I found was that the participation rate, which is the number of people working in the job that could work in the job, for male, this is 5 years out from graduation, for males working in engineering jobs was 91%, and for females it was 96%, which made it quite clear that industry really gets it, and they are receiving considerable pressure to have more females in their engineering workforce. I've spoken to a number of consultancies that said they've lost jobs because they couldn't put forward enough key female personnel in their proposal. And so industry's come on board with scholarships and turning up to recruitment events, and that has been key. Now, the reason it's been key is that the male engineers out of the industry that turn up, they don't tend to influence the schoolgirls that much, but they have a mighty impact on their parents. And parents are a really key influencer, because where the schools are certainly a challenge. There's a number of studies that said, particularly for women who do engineering, they've listened more to their family than they have to their teachers. And so the two groups that I really think is industry actually get their messaging, rather than actually is the important part, provide them a vehicle, and parents are the two groups.
So that, to me, speaks to raising the profile and I guess the status of engineering amongst the key influencers, the parents and the people who are nagging kids to get a great job and to earn good money. And that's got to be a good thing. It's more of a pull than a push.
Yep, definitely.
Exactly. And that sort of reminds me of something we were talking about earlier, Madhu, which was that you did your bachelor's degree in India. And we know that in India and China, big, enormous emerging economies, that engineering has a much higher status. And there is not really a surprising consequence of that, is that women actually dominate in numbers in engineering. Would you like to sort of tease that out a bit more?
So I think the stats stand at 60% or 57% in India and China of women flock towards engineering specifically. And again, I think it kind of ties in pretty well with his point in terms of, you know, how parents play a key role, and for women to do engineering and choose engineering, parents are critical. And India and China are two of those economies where family role is much more than probably in Western society in some sense. And the thing which I strongly keep us talking about over here was everyone there gets the value of engineering and math. Like I had my grandmother who's not gone through school education, but she used to encourage me to do really well in math. It doesn't require you to go through school and university to truly understand the value of engineering and math in some sense. So in a society, I think there's a society change. There's a strong value, and everyone understands that engineering is a career which will set you up well financially in the future. It is the jobs of the future will require engineering. And it's not education which provides that. There's an inherent understanding, which has probably come across from many, many generations. It's not overnight. Because I've studied with girls who come from very low socioeconomic backgrounds. Their fathers have been laborers or farmers, and they get the value of engineering. And in India, it's also a prestige thing. It's a financial status thing. It's a pride, for people to say, my daughter's an engineer. And I don't think we're quite there yet. For me, when I first came here in 2004, and it's taken me a few years to actually understand why is there a problem. Because for me, it's like a dirt thing for me, right? I mean, doing engineering, we all do engineering over there. It's no biggie. We have our own set of problems. I'm not painting a very rosy picture of India. I mean, you get a lot of girls into engineering over there, and then we have our own issues later on in the career where, you have more cultural issues and societal issues and chauvinistic societies and things like that. So our problems in that kind of a sector crop up later. We don't have a pipeline problem in the beginning. Problems in thriving careers might become an issue later. But I think those are the key points. And I think convincing parents, and I think even with the engineering sector which is here, a lot of them are international students. So I sit as an associate dean for higher degrees by research students, which are students who do PhD degrees and masters by research. 50% of them are international. So if my numbers of women are looking good, if I dig a little deeper, I'll find that the numbers are actually emerging more from the international sector rather than the domestic.
Can I pick up on that? So one of the things that gets lost in these discussions sometimes is that Australia produces half as many engineers as we need. The rest of the positions are filled by skilled migration. Australia also produces 3 times as many scientists as can find meaningful employment. Just saying. Sorry. Anyway, just saying. Yeah, that might have been my out loud voice. And in fact, in Australia...
I'm actually British as well.
And has a really, really interesting journey into that
import.
profession. So if you get the chance, go and quiz Lisa afterwards. It's really interesting. My point is that in Australia, the number of school students in general who were taking the courses that would give them the prerequisites necessary to get into engineering peaked in 2017. So the situation's actually getting worse. And so actually the conversation we should be having is how do we make engineering and computing, because the distinction between the two is artificial and unhelpful in this instance, how do we make engineering and computing more visible, more attractive in general? Because what's happening is that young girls are disproportionately falling off, but actually we've got young people falling off altogether. And that's our problem, because the workforce shortages in Australia in all of those disciplines are enormous and growing. And like Mark, I spend most of my time going and talking with employers, and they just keep saying, I need more people, where are the people, where are the people, where are the people? And we are not providing them with the people. And so if we think about it that way, you actually end up with a very, very different conversation, because it's about convincing parents of all kinds to that this is actually a meaningful and a useful thing. And if you think about why have we peaked, why have we essentially saturated that market, it's because we've been talking to the same people since 1850. And so that group of people, there are no more of them. It's time now to start talking to a more diverse group of people, which means that it's not just about women, it's about people who come from regional and remote areas, it's about Aboriginal Australians, it's about people who have come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, it's the whole lot. And if we don't do that, all we're going to do is just get more white, middle-class, urban, female Australians. Mm-hmm. And I think actually we're not even going to succeed at that.
Yeah. And I just think when we heard Sue Black's amazing story this morning, how many universities are encouraging women who may have been interested in engineering but didn't do it, and then are doing something else because of life circumstances. How many opportunities are we providing to re-enter back into the education to do these sorts of courses? And I found that her mum's program, if you had to think about it, it could just be for any people from diverse groups who are underrepresented, we should be trying to encourage that sort of step as well. So we need these sort of bridging courses. And I know of one example, but I'm sure there's more, that Deakin University have got a special intake for more mature women who have gone past their point of doing engineering but wanting to, might want to try doing it, and so they have a program. So, I think we need to actually fill this gap from multiple perspectives as well.
So what sort of level of responsibility do you think universities have in designing the world? And maybe this is for Eleanor to start with, but is it the push from the education system to prepare people for university? Is it the demand from industry, from universities themselves, that creates that natural path that then the education system responds to?
So this might surprise you to hear me say this, but actually I think universities need to get the hell out of the way. We spend far too much time saying, hey, come to UNSW, hey, come to ANU, hey, come to Monash, and do an amazing engineering degree with us. Do that. What we should actually be doing is exactly much more of what Mark's been talking about, which is to say, hey, look at these amazing careers and lifestyles and life choices you can make. This is the world you are making. This is the world that we want you to make. By the way, you've got to come through Monash, ANU or UNSW to do that, but actually we need to get out of their field of view.
So less recruitment.
More nuanced recruitment,
right.
And be really clear about the fact that this is a lifelong journey. And as Margaret said, you don't have to, that lifelong journey doesn't need to touch a university necessarily only when you're 18. It could be when you're 35, it could be whenever. And we need to be responding to a very, very different world that sits around us. But actually it's hubris of the most antisocial kind for us to think that we are the sole solution here. This is a big, complicated, integrated, interconnected system, and we're part of it. We absolutely can be shaping the part of that, and we're doing stuff at ANU to come at it from a very different direction, which is to ask more subtly, what are the engineering and computing skills necessary for 2050? Who will be exercising them and how? Which is not the same as saying, hey, this is our Bachelor of Electrical Engineering and these are the courses you need to do and these are the prerequisites.
So what specific interventions are you doing within ANU?
So we've got a couple of early experiments, and so engineering at ANU has always done systems engineering, and that's left us in an interesting place where we've always been at about 20% women right from the start, which 10 years ago made us incredibly distinctively different, but now actually we have gone up and we're keeping pace with most of the other universities, but actually we're not. Our gender statistics are no longer really incredibly distinctively different, which is an interesting thing to think about. Because one of the things is that people talk about the engineering statistics where we're sort of 17% women, but that's extremely lumpy, right?
Yeah.
So in biochemistry, environmental, we're sitting at above 40% women. Civil, electrical, mechanicals around 4%, and computer science is sitting around 15 or so. So for us to have been systems engineering, we've kind of been at that average since forever. And so the interesting thing for us is, what does that mean? So we're having a conversation about what that means for us. We've also been concentrating in the master space about doing things that take people who come from different backgrounds and value that experience and add other things to it, rather than saying, okay, we're going to strip you all of your previous experience, we're going to treat you like an 18-year-old and we're going to turn you into what we used to think of as an electrical engineer. So we've got a couple of master's programs that explicitly combine computer science, statistics and social science as being one example of that. We've also got a master's program in autonomy, agency and assurance, which is all about how you take AI to scale, and it has AI in it, it has computer science in it, but what it also has is anthropology, psychology, design, a whole bunch of other things, and we're looking to do things that will be attractive to folks who don't just wake up one morning and think, right, I want to wear a yellow hard hat and stand in front of a lump of concrete and do stuff like that. Noting that I'm an electrical engineer and I'm allowed to be rude to civil engineers.
Lisa, I was wondering, just picking up what Mark's saying, you said, what can we do about it? I mean, I think governments are also seeing this problem as well,
Indeed.
just generally about STEM, and certainly engineering specifically. Because I know in Victoria, really it's come out of jointly with the Education Department, but is a push from Jobs of the Future. They've created a system of what they've called tech schools, and a lot of people, I don't know if you're from Victoria, but the old tech schools used to be high school and tech school, but these are actually supplementary programs that clusters of high schools can then send their students for a really extreme science experience in terms of, and it's industry linked as well, so real company issues come forward and they problem solve and, you know, inspire them in that. So I think governments also see that the supply of the future workforce is a really critical matter for us. If we are going to take full advantage out of the tech revolutions that are coming and still maintain social cohesion, then we're going to need, you know, a really skilled workforce to do that. So, and the New South Wales, the government's just reviewing the curriculum in the school, and that's a great opportunity to engage with them as well. So I think, you know, it's industry linking directly to schools is a really interesting, challenging thing that's happening, and it's being trialled in Victoria at the moment. So there's and it's regional as well as metropolitan centres. So we're watching that with great interest because that might give us some clues as well.
Yeah.
Just, in part going to support what was just said. I've just finished a major review of for the German government, a part of their tertiary education system, and I'm in the middle of something similar in Hong Kong. And what those reviews are looking at is the whole link between what people study and what's actually needed in the workforce. And in Australia, we don't even think of that. The point that Elanor made, that effectively we've got 3 times as many people graduating with science degrees as our workforce needs, but we report half our engineering workforce, I think is a real testament to that. And universities, Elanor spoke about what she's doing, and I think one part of it is that the universities we've got here, such as Monash, ANU, UNSW, the students that we bring in are far smarter than you need to have to graduate from an engineering degree. We know that. The completion rates are very, very high because we get more people applying than we actually need. Now, the university system in Australia, if you don't bring in large volumes of students, then you've got a real problem, sort of an existential problem. So what's happening is we collectively would probably represent about a bit over 30% of the engineering places in Australia, but it's a long tail from regional and other universities who really don't have that luxury. So they will just bring in students and they're not going to start considering what's needed for the future because the system just doesn't have that luxury. And the only way of overcoming that is to have some sort of, shall we say, skills strategy. And I think while the states are doing it, it's a national issue. And it's quite silent at a national level.
Is that a federal education department responsibility, do you think, or someone else?
I think it's something that probably has to be done by COAG because the states have control of the school system and the federal government has the university system. Yeah. And it's something, but if you look what comes on the list on sort of at COAG, it hasn't really hit yet. But we do have a national curriculum that schools are appearing, so it's a good start.
Yeah. Mark, I did want to ask you to maybe give some more examples of things that UNSW is doing in engineering in particular. Because you mentioned earlier your target very briefly that you're almost meeting, and I'd like to know a bit more about how you achieved that.
And the first thing I should probably say is we've done lots of things, and in a way I struggle to differentiate exactly which ones have worked particularly well. It's a very it's not an exact science, and also people are different, and different things work for different people. I think the 3 things that I probably would mention is I came into the role of Dean with an industry advisory committee which I'd inherited, which was basically saying, you're not giving us enough women, we need more women on our boards. And I must admit I was saying that sort of entering an undergraduate program and ending up on a board is probably quite a pathway. But let's
like
start.
25 years. Yeah.
But that, and then there was a camp which was essentially taking girls in high school in sort of years 10 and 11. New South Wales, you do 12 years. And the conversion, and it was bringing in, I think, 20, 25 for a week or so in January. And of those 25, the data was showing that consistently between 60 and 70% were then ending up in an engineering program at UNSW. And it immediately tweaked to me that it wasn't anything except nobody knew what was involved, which is essentially Margaret's point. And so being a Dean of Engineering is trying to the first thing you do is expand the number of women in the camp. And so we took it in 1 year out to 110, and we got sponsorship from Origin Energy, which was at that time run by Grant King, who now chairs the Business Council of Australia, who gave us very substantial sponsorship. We increased it to 110, and of that 110, just under 80 ended up in engineering programs at UNSW. And given that we pulled from a broad pool, I'm quite sure that there would be a very large proportion went and did engineering elsewhere as well. And so it was very much a lesson to me. People just need to know what's involved. Once they find what it is, because we take them in, give them a few tasks, take them out to a few companies. They went to Qantas, they went to Cochlear, a few things like that. And it wasn't a hard sell. It was just, this is what happens. The other vehicle was to get it known that industry is interested. And that was essentially going out to companies and saying, please give us a scholarship. $10,000 a year, please, for 4 years for an engineering program, and we'll advertise it and we'll get someone in. Now, when you're doing recruiting, particularly scholarships into university, for every scholarship, you'll then get another bunch of people who'll come simply because the scholarship exists, even if they don't get it. And we then got a big pool of applicants for these scholarships, who we then telephoned and explained what engineering was. And again, we did that explanation of what's happening. Now, the total number of scholarships now, it still wouldn't even be 50. But we've got 1,400 more female engineering students. So there's something happening there. The other part of it is to actually do the role models piece. So because the pool's been growing, we're getting quite a large cohort of female engineering graduates. And we now have a process where they come back and mentor existing students. The actual retention issue is not too much of a problem, we're finding, and this is a part of it. And they mentor and they create role models. There's two gaps we've got, if I may mention. One of them is, while we may have 28% female engineering students, the senior academic people who are teaching them is in the 15 to 20% zone. And that's certainly an issue that concerns me a lot. The other problem we were having is when students come in their first year, just by the nature of it, engineering's design, so we have a group design project. And we were getting a lot of ad hoc feedback that the female students were feeling pretty uncomfortable in those groups in first year. Now, it's getting a little bit better as the numbers go up, because when they started, they were invariably the only female in the group of 5 or 6. Yep. And we did do an intervention this year, which has been very effective. We basically, instead of saying, this is your group, go and do it, early on in the process, we ran some workshops for everyone, and there's 900 students in this class, so it's a production line, it's an exercise, essentially on what does working in a group mean, and getting people to understand. Now, I often crudely say that the exercise was teaching teenage boys to behave themselves, but it was very effective. And what's actually happened there is the number of group problems that we've had, and we did have quite a number of them, has dropped dramatically. And that to me was a lesson that everybody wants this to happen, but nobody sort of thinks about some of the clear interventions. And it's low-hanging fruit, to tell you the truth.
It's the first time I've ever heard someone say a fixing the men problem instead of a fixing the women situation, because normally the women are taken out and trained on something, and that's quite refreshing.
Well, we fixed everyone, I have to
say.
Indeed.
Fixing people are a pain in the back.
Yes. Yeah. The traditional approach of calling it undergraduate teamwork, when actually it's just an anarchic collective.
That's right.
Lisa, this is just going to the point of how important inclusion is in all of the things we do.
Yeah.
And I think, there's anecdotal stories that I'm aware of that as part of some work we did on the culture of engineering firms in Australia.
Yep.
Very blokey, very... and not so much the big companies, because I think they're all working, as Mark says, they know they need more women, they're desperate to get there, because it's about their business arrangements. Their boards and their shareholders want to see diversity and inclusion, and so there's a real drive happening. But in smaller companies, I've heard some pretty amazing anecdotal stories where, a young woman engineer might arrive, but, it's not included, or it's makes the tea for the first week or something. It's quite challenging. And so part of the thing in the decadal plan for women in STEM is our academy is willing to work with we're looking at working with the Australian Industry Group and a few others and companies to actually see, can we provide some tools to allow diversity and inclusion policies and practices be picked up in SMEs in particular, because it's a large employing workforce and it's not touched by workplace gender equity laws, and it's not touched by the SAGE program that's happening. Yeah. And so they fly under the radar quite a bit, and there's still a number of companies with all male boards. So at the end too, I think there's an obligation to make sure that the culture of the workplace is actually also aware that if we're going to have more women, and certainly we've had great support from companies who are willing to pilot it for us, but they're also saying, look, after time, there's a role for government and big industry to say to their suppliers and to their to the companies who they purchase from or from which they provide services to, that we are going to expect to see gender equity and diversity and inclusion policies in place in your company if you want to do business with us. So I think change is going to happen, and I think it's been driven a lot by larger companies, as Mark's described. So it's never in one spot that you can fix a complex problem. It's right up and down the chain.
That's right. Madhu, I wanted to ask you about RMIT. You run the engineering faculty there. So what's the status at RMIT University in engineering? Do you have targets for female participation? Is that something you're working on? Do you have particular engagements with the community to try and improve diversity of undergraduates, for example?
Probably the wrong person to be talking to, because I don't sit across the entire School of Engineering and look after the undergraduate programs. There's definite targets, and I think in RMIT for the last few years, the focus has been more on the inclusion rather than the diversity, given the diversity is a numbers game and inclusion is a cultural piece, and much more work to be done on it, especially also around the other genders, and the inclusion piece is definitely much more in RMIT than on the gender-specific targets. But with my role on as the Associate Dean for Higher Degrees by Research, so with the cohort of 600 engineering students I have who are doing higher degrees by research degrees over there, there was definitely, so for instance, I created the Women Researchers Network, and that was more in the academia. That was something which never existed. The situation was quite bad to the extent that when I took my maternity leave in 2013, I was the first engineering staff member in 20 years to have taken maternity leave.
Is that because you're the only woman?
They didn't know what to do with me, because they just said, we don't know what kind of conversations we need to be having with you, because you're the first person in 20 years to have taken maternity leave in engineering.
That's reassuring.
And that was what literally opened my eyes up to the problem. Until then, I had no idea. And with the academia and with the higher degrees by research, what we're finding is, yes, there are more and more international students, but we're also getting more and more mature age students. So the problems are much more varied. They all have young families. So it's not just girls coming straight out of undergrad, postgrad, and then doing a PhD. They're coming back when they're in their 30s, mid-30s, early 40s. That throws in a whole bunch of challenges. Childcare becomes a problem. You're traveling to a conference, how are you supposed to look after them? So the challenges are much more varied than just making sure that they're in, and then you have the stereotyping, and you have the harassment, and you have those kind of issues aside. The problems are a bit different, I guess, in the PhD sector. But one other point which I wanted to touch on, which is not related to what you asked me, but nevertheless, this is media training. I was told, answer whatever you want to answer, irrespective of what the question is.
That's not the interesting question. This is the interesting question.
I think Elanor touched on this earlier. The numbers 17% look bad enough, but when you drill down further into the types of engineering and looking into the various types of engineering, one incident which really stood out for me was I went into a leading girls' school in Victoria. It's a premium institution for girls. It was a girls-only high school. I went there and I stood there and I spoke about my research for like 5 minutes. I'm an electronics engineer, by the way. And I actually had 7 girls come and speak to me after that saying, I never knew you're an engineer and I never knew an engineer does electronics. I thought an engineer wears a hard hat. And I was just flabbergasted, thinking that, it's a leading girls' school. It's a selective entry school, actually. And to have girls at that, with that kind of resources available to them, to still have that kind of stereotyping over there, it was shocking. And that was pretty much a time whenever I go around introducing myself, I no longer say I'm a researcher in university. I actually say I'm an electronics engineer. A taxi driver asked me, what do you do? I said, I'm an electronics engineer. And that was the point I was telling someone else in the audience as well. I think it helps. The more we call ourselves engineer, I think people realize we're normal. So if you're an engineer in the audience, go and say you're an engineer. Don't call yourself a researcher or a PhD student. Say I'm an engineer first. I think it helps.
Yeah, like that. Full disclosure, if you're an astrophysicist now, people think of the Big Bang Theory, so that's not necessarily a good thing either. Look, we'll open up to questions and discussion from all of you in just 1 second. I just wanted to throw in one last curly question, I guess. To think about as a nation, we've talked about the skill shortages in certain areas, how we're importing half of our engineers, how we have 3 times too many scientists. I'm very sorry, I'll stop doing outreach. Too many astronomers, but
That's okay. They all become data scientists.
yeah,
it's
that's
fine.
it. Become useful members of society. But the question is, how should Australia be, as a nation, be preparing our people, not just our young people, but our, all age people for the jobs of the future, which are going to transform, as we know.
No,
How should we be doing this as a nation?
I think it's an absolutely critical issue that we have to really face. I mean, we're doing some research at the Academy. We've got a 3-year program running about is Australian industry technology ready? Because if you're not, then we're going to miss out on a huge wave of opportunity and be left behind. And this is about the capacity to have technological change with social cohesion, because we need to do both. But if we're not thinking about it and getting all of our companies ready for this, I mean, I think some people think that only applies to those technology companies, but there's not going to be one company that I can think of that won't be needing some STEM skilled workforce component as we move to digitalisation, and we need to be ready for that. And we need to be starting now to help workforces transition. I always use the example, don't wait to close down the car industry to then say, what are we going to do with that workforce? That workforce should have been undergoing ongoing training and skills update from the day you start work. And we don't really run our businesses quite like that. So I think ongoing skilling up so that transition is easier and not just to wait till something rolls over us and think, oh, what are we going to do now? So I think if we're not planned and ready, it's a major component to government policy and to industry policy.
Marty,
I'm pretty clear on it.
comments on that?
I want to start really young. Like I want books to be available for 1.5-year-olds and 2-year-olds to pick up and read and actually have pictures of what an engineer looks like. And no, that's not a man in a hard hat, but variety of engineers. I really struggle. Like when I was trying to explain to my son what I do and what an engineer looks like, it was very hard to find any kind of material to teach them. And I think it starts really early. Sometimes 10-year-olds, 14-year-olds, your image in your head has already been formed, and I think you need to start really, really early.
I've just written that book, by the way. It's called Under the Stars. It's out October the 1st.
I saw that.
Sorry, carry on. But yeah, absolutely right. So very young children influencing their perceptions before other people can influence the perceptions. Yeah, that's important. Mark?
I've got 2 points. One, to answer that, it's not all doom and gloom. The thing that really comes to my mind is these robotics competitions that are run in primary schools. I don't know if any of you have struck them. I struck it with my own kids where the teacher said we're doing it on a Saturday, so it's an inspired teacher. And one of my children was doing it, and they said parents can come along and help. So I turned up at 9 o'clock. I was going to leave by 9:30, and somehow it was 3:30 and when I looked at my watch. But then I went along to some of these competitions, and it was the Sydney Convention Centre. I don't know if you've been there. It's an awful place. It's just like an indoor sort of 5 AFL fields all indoors. And it was just completely covered in kids running all their robots. And it was quite clear that these kids, they knew programming, they knew a whole stack of engineering skills, and it was happening. There was no doubt about it. And it suddenly struck me, why that's the kids who want to get into robots. Why aren't we doing something for prosthetic limbs or clean water or something like that? And this is, I think, a positive story. It's not thumping the teachers, it's just providing vehicles. The other part of it in terms of providing vehicles and the workforce is that most universities run what's called coursework master's programs. They're 1 to 2 years, and they're generally designed not so much for people who are, say, a mechanical engineer to become a better mechanical engineer, but someone who studied something else a little bit orthogonal to learn mechanical engineering skills. And Elanor mentioned that they're now happening in robotics and AI, etc. To do those programs, if you're an Australian, there are a very small number of places you can get where you don't pay fees, or generally you're looking at somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000 a year to do that. And it is a classic upskilling exercise.
Yep, too expensive.
And one can fully understand why someone is quite nervous about forking out that sort of money when they're not completely confident they're going to recoup it in the next sort of 4 to 5 years in income. They might do it for a business degree, but for the actual technical skills. And that, to me, is a very clear, practical, it already exists venue for actually upskilling workforces.
Absolutely.
Elanor.
Well, and so to amplify on that, I guess for me, if you think in terms of where Australia's economy sits, the fact that we are at risk of missing out on what is the next global revolution. Our people are going to miss out on that. We are going to struggle with social cohesion. We are making a world that at the moment only reflects less than half of the experiences of half of the people in Australia. We have a long, slow burn if we're going to get into the hearts and minds of 1.5-year-olds. That means that they're not actually going to graduate with their degree until 2054. So what do we do about that? I think actually to pick up on Mark's observation and to provide the same answer that I give to a whole bunch of employers, there is a gigantic pool of people 35 to 65 out there who are smart. They didn't see the light that we saw when we were 15. We should not exclude them from this wonderful journey.
We should be born-again engineers.
Indeed, we should be going out there and getting them. This is the way to make this happen. And to not, and many people in this room have heard me get on this soapbox before. I think it's wonderful that the level of discourse around STEM has increased over the last 5 to 10 years. There is a problem with that acronym. It's turned into a word and it's turned into a synonym for science. Now, the problem with that is that science and maths is motivated by a desire to understand. Technology is about building things. Engineering is about solving human problems, using your mastery of science and maths to build things. That's a completely 4 different sets of motivations, and the more that we talk about it as a monolithic lump, the more that we're going to struggle with that. And so if I was to ask anyone to do anything, it's go talk to somebody who's 35 and explain to them that engineering is not science. And that includes computation and computational thinking. The old silos don't make any sense whatsoever anymore. We need to be making the world that we want to live in, and that's got computation inside of physical objects.
Who pays for retraining?
I think we have to be serious about this, and I saw you writing stuff down because you have lines of influence, so that's really good. Absolutely. Postgraduate education that is targeted, specific, and is in the national interest is the only way that we're going to do this. We're asking people to sometimes bet their house and their kids' future on that, and that's not reasonable.
And I don't think we should overlook the fact that industry will also pay to train their workers. So, and I think there's a real business opportunity for universities to start looking at running not necessarily degree-type courses or diploma courses or anything, but to actually be responsive to take specific training in their facilities for a company who are willing to pay. I know there's a couple of companies in Melbourne who, were global leaders in technology, and they want to upskill some of their workforce, but they don't want to send them off to do another diploma or degree because they've already got qualifications. So I think we need to really rethink, it's not a modular sort of stuff. We might have to start tailoring education, but certainly industry are willing to pay for it.
Indeed.
And I think we just all need to realise that X% of your budget, if you're operating a business, has to go on training, and it should be mandatory in a company that wants to keep ahead.
Or at least culturally mandatory.
Culturally mandatory, I suppose.
Yeah.
Boards need to own this too.
To pick up on that, however, it is worth remembering that in Australia, 95% of companies have 10 or fewer employees. And so actually they can't afford to do it either, which is why we need some intervention to do this for the companies and employers that just simply can't afford to do it. Yep.
Well, certainly if you have a look at the alternative, is that when there are large-scale closures of an industry, it's government who picks up
Correct.
the cost in unemployment and retraining and removing a workforce. So, in the end, some incentives to SMEs to do that would be cost-effective to government as well.
All right, we've almost solved the world, but I want to hear your ideas now from the
let's
floor.
go out and do it.
Your questions, you want to spruik stuff your company's doing, anything like that. We've got a good almost 15 minutes, pretty much, and it would be good for people to use the microphone, please. So we have a roving one, or you can go and stand by that one if you like. I think we'll start over here because I saw your hand first. Thank you. If you could just say who you are and where you work, if that's relevant, and then a nice, clear question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ellie. I actually have a few notes from the session.
Are they questions?
I don't know, a few notes. One, I have a baby girl, and I have baby books that are coding for babies, quantum mechanics for babies, ABC of mathematics. They are all hardcover. I also have other books about women. Hello Ruby, that teaches young girls how to code, and various other ones that give examples of women in tech. I can recommend multiple books, many books. I wanted to talk about the entry to engineering is through universities, and I'll talk about computer science, and it's not necessarily only through university degrees. I looked at doing Masters of Computer Science, and when I looked at the curriculum, I was very much did not want to do the program. I've been an engineer for 12 years now. I emphasize that the problem universities have, I empathize with the problems the universities have, but there are other problems. Getting into software development, people now do boot camps that are a lot shorter than a degree, and various companies in Melbourne now run engineering apprenticeship programs that are paid programs. MyoB does that, Zendesk, REA, Qantas Hotels, Culture, to name a few. ANZ started a reskilling accelerator to get women back into the engineering department, again, paid accelerator. Mm-hmm. Increasing the funnel still does not mean that these diverse groups will stick around at the workforce. So besides convincing people to study tech, I see three major other problems. Implicit biases and ad hoc hiring processes at workplaces. I see that a lot. Supporting juniors at the workplace, and supporting women at the workplace specifically. And then I wanted to talk about something that Elanor said about reskilling people. Living Social had a problem that they could not find enough people to hire a few years ago. So they ran something that was called the Hunger Academy that was run by Jeff Casimir. And what they did, they looked at people they looked for specific characteristics in people, and they found pilots and lawyers and accountants and anything else, and then they paid them for 6 months to reskill them as engineers. Yep. So this is another avenue. Sorry, just a few things that
Thank you. Thanks for that. Thank you very much. Okay, I saw in the middle here. Thank you. Next.
Hello, Lauren Black from University of Technology. I'm really grateful that you brought up the point about who pays for retraining. We have just piloted a primary school program, and I suppose the biggest issue is who pays, because universities go, oh, it's so far from recruitment, and industry goes, oh, it's even further from recruitment. So I suppose as leaders, who pays?
Yeah.
I mean, well, so you've sort of set up a primary school program. There actually are government funds available in terms of, there have been under the, schools program in Women in STEM. So we've certainly done that, but not enough. And also I think it's a matter of having a look at I'm not sure, but I know Victoria did have some of that funding.
WISE grant.
The WISE grant in the federal government, and I think WISE is still running.
There'll be another round.
Yeah.
Probably,
Great,
yes.
yeah. So that's been a flexible and useful process. I think the trouble is that if if you fund programs like that, you should be expected to be evaluated in your impact, so that we're actually getting value for that support. Because I think that's the other thing. People implement programs, and we've done it ourselves at the Academy. We've closed down 2 very successful, highly supported through sponsorship programs, because when we evaluated them, they didn't shift the dial. Kids had a great time. We were only going to the teachers that were really skilled and fantastic. It was all extracurricular. I still wear a hair shirt from closing those down with the board, but with some fellows who were passionate about it. But we really have to be only investing in things that actually make a difference. So I think evaluation, and that's why I like the government programs like WISE, because they are going to ask for evaluation on effectiveness. So, I think we should have more of those. Yeah.
I just jump in this because I think it's something that I've heard Lisa talk about, that if you really dig deep and spends lots of time on Google, you'll find that there are programs to do this, but they tend to be small and ad hoc.
I was going to say.
And if you look at the total amount of money spent, it's in some cases it's not too bad, but the actual coherency, they're all put up as a pilot program. They run till 1.5 years.
Exactly.
And I think I've got no problem actually saying the government should do it, because I'm not actually asking the government to spend any more money. I'm just asking them to sort of get themselves in order and have a bit of a policy and a structure to it.
Yeah, we've got so many pilots in Australia, we could run an airline.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Next question.
So I'm Jessie Oliver, and I'm from the Australian Citizen Science Association and also with the Queensland University of Technology. And I have 2 points that I hope to make, and I will try to form questions. But I also have a suggestion. If you really want to find a crowd of people desperately looking for jobs, I come from the ecology discipline traditionally, wildlife, and trying to come into engineering and design, I find similar difficulties with when I transitioned into these areas. What are they? And that wasn't clear to me, even coming in as a biologist. And so I think that messaging is really important. And I'm curious, my first question, so you're talking about having a difficulty with the definitions, and it seems to be technology-wide, really. And that limits not just women, but lots of other types of diversity and groups. And so how do you think realistically that can be overcome? In reality, besides, childhood books, I didn't have access to them. I assumed that engineers wore hard hats, and I didn't know what a designer was. I thought of interior decorator. I mean, when I started in the early, looking into what am I going to do to try and bring people to using technology to help wildlife, that was my goal. And then I found out about this whole HCI thing, and then here I am. So, yeah. So I'm wondering if you have suggestions to that.
I think the more you can tell authentic stories about people who are doing something in that field, the more use that is. I mean, it's a matter of, we've made videos for school projects, but, we published them through the Science Channel and they wound up on iView. So, I mean, the more we can have material out there that actually shows personal stories of what an engineer or a technologist is doing, and the greater the coverage of all of the varieties of work that you can do, I think helps. I mean, I think that's one aspect.
If I can elaborate a little bit too. So, for example, if I'm to talk about the sneaky little species that I try to find with the tech, people love that, and then that's all they hear. or they hear the term citizen science, their interpretation of it goes out in, and that's all mixed up too. And then it's like, no, my research is actually technology design. And then they're like, okay, so what tech product are you creating at the end? And it's like, no, I'm doing the research to understand what needs to go into development of tech into the future. And I find that really challenging. So I'm wondering if there's some kind of group like yourselves that are actually having conversations about messaging and communication and how to grapple with that, because I think that's probably one of your biggest issues and assets to overcome.
So look, I don't think we know exactly what the answer is, but as Lisa said, one of the things that we are looking into at the moment is trying to understand pathways into these disciplines. Now, they're the existing pathways, so it's not going to tell us how to widen that, but at least it gives us a beginning, and hopefully it will give us some hint as to what are the interventions necessary to, okay, I'm going to mix metaphors now. Instead of pathways, water channels, how do we carve a new channel or a couple of new channels or widen a few that will make that more obvious and more simple, because this is not a simple conversation to have, but we don't even understand how we've got to where we are, let alone how in God's name we actually fix it.
Thank you.
There was one more question.
One at the back.
So I come from a slightly different perspective, being a little bit older. When I went to college, my mother also went to college and got her comp sci degree. Single mom with 4 kids, by the way. And then we competed for the next 20 years to see who could make the most money and get the most certifications. And so, that was kind of an incentive, because I'd be thinking I was doing pretty good. And my mom would call and say, just got a 5% raise, beat that. So going forward. But the funny thing is that I have 2 sons, and neither one of them chose to go into engineering, and it was because they said, Mom, we watched you work your ass off for 20 some odd years. You had no work-life balance. We want a better life.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that when you guys talk about perception, there's also this perception that if you go into engineering, you don't have a life. And so I haven't heard you guys kind of mention that, that the generation coming up would like a little bit better work-life balance than we had. Do you have any suggestions to address that? Because I have a goddaughter who's 9, and I'd really like to, I failed with my sons. I'd like to do better with my goddaughter. Can
I jump in there? I've always been of the view that it's not work-life balance, it's work-life harmony, making the two work together. And I had a colleague, actually. She was an optometrist she was a single mum and was working, and the way she did it was to actually get her family involved in her work. And now, for example, when I travel for work, I tend to take one of my kids with me. I took my daughter on the solar car race from Darwin to Adelaide. My daughter had no interest in what I did whatsoever, and now she desperately wants to be like 2 of the other women on that team, to be an electrical engineer. And so I've expanded this out to the workforce that I have, and I just try to make sure that people feel comfortable getting their families involved or integrated and understanding their work. And I think that's the way we have to do it, because I don't think we can basically say, well, everyone's going to work less. It's pushing too hard against the flow. But getting actually everybody integrated in having work and life as a harmony is a path, I think, is the way that as a country we can probably go, including engineers. There's most of what engineers do. There's no reason why it has to be a wall between work and home.
Can I just jump in here? And I think flexible work goes a long way in getting that message across. If my son sees me, be able to do the work pickup and then go back, and then if I need to catch up on work, I can do the catching up on work. Take him along to a conference, bring him back. If he can see me doing all those things, and every time I talk to people about careers, I speak about flexible work. But no offense, I had 2 parents, medical doctors, and they tried their hardest to make me into a medical doctor, and I ran in the opposite direction. So I think parents sometimes are probably the worst, role models. I can assure you my son's not going to be an engineer, but we can try with our grandchildren or godchildren, I guess.
And just to connect up a couple of dots about not just fixing the women, one of the strongest movements at the moment is to realise that structurally, we have done just about as much as we possibly can in terms of changing the legislative and structural settings to make workplaces more flexible for women. It's now, to quote Annabelle Crabb, it's time for women to get a wife and for men to get a life. And so, if you look at the statistics, the vast majority of academic men do not have wives who are in academia. The vast majority of academic women do have husbands in academia. The same is true in, the same pattern actually rolls out amongst tech people usually as well. So the interesting thing is that if you were to say, okay, take large employers, because it has to be large ones because they're the only ones who can afford it. So universities, big tech companies, all the rest of it, if they were to get to the point where they set industrial settings so that men got lives and there was actually more of the work-life harmony, then you would actually send a whole different set of setting life setting signals to people. And so, for example, our Vice-Chancellor, who's really, really committed to this, just recently changed the way that we do maternity leave at the ANU so that primary carers, regardless of gender, get to and indeed are encouraged to share what used to be just maternity leave and things like that. And that, in a university, makes a massive difference because the vast majority of academic women have academic husbands. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about and how you would roll that out more broadly in the sense of not just making kids look at their mothers who are simultaneously trying to make an amazing career as well as keep the wheels on at home. And that's I think probably the place where we can have the most significant intervention in the future.
Oh, brilliant. I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap it up here. I'm afraid I'm getting daggers and from the clock as well.
It's encouragement.
I'm afraid we encourage yeah, we've got some brilliant discussions, but I'm afraid I have to wrap it up there. We'll get kicked out of the room otherwise. Look, thank you everyone on the panel. You've been fantastic. Thanks to the audience, your great questions. If you have further questions, just discussions, come and talk to us. We'll be hanging around the coffee machine, no doubt. So thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, panel, again.